welcome to this second AOECS webinar of a series of webinars we are organizing in the month of May, because as you know, it's the month where we celebrate or try to raise awareness about celiac disease and how it's living with without gluten. Today we count, I think, with a perfect panel. Although we're still waiting for one speaker, I really hope he can join us in a second. But if not, we move ahead, still with a fabulous panelist that I think will be, as I say, the perfect candidates to help us to shed some light on what does it need to be done in order to make celiac disease more attractive to researchers. The presentation will be 30 minutes in total, kind of, although we have, as I just said, one speaker less right now. But we hope that after their presentations, we will be able to open the floor for questions and answers on your side. I ask everybody to get mute. Unfortunately, I alone, so I'm trying to talk and mute you at the same time, but I will really appreciate that you do it yourself, because it's not really professional if we keep the background noise as we are registered in the webinar. Before we start and I give the floor to the speakers, please allow me a few minutes to talk about what celiac disease is and who we are, the AOECS. So for those that are not familiar, celiac disease is an autoimmune disease caused by the ingestion of food that contains gluten. And gluten is a type of protein that you can find in a few cereals such as wheat, barley, or rye. Celiac disease affects around 1.3% of the population, and if it remains undiagnosed, it can result in symptoms that can vary from minor discomfort to really life-threatening conditions like severe anemia. Today, the only known effective treatment is a strict lifelong gluten-free diet. And the Association of European Celiac Societies, AOECS, which is a non-for-profit umbrella organization made of national celiac societies in Europe and beyond, work together with our members to really represent the voice of those celiac patients and their relatives in over 40 countries. We promote strategic partnerships to raise awareness on celiac disease, but also we encourage as much as possible research for improving the life of celiacs, the early diagnosis of this disease, better access to gluten-free food, and of course, the cure as possible. The AOECS owns the AOECS standard for pre-packed food products and the cross-grain license system that is managed by our own members in the respective countries. And thanks to that scheme, we can allow safe gluten-free food products being accessible in all the markets in Europe today. And that is really easily to recognize by the final consumer. I would like to take the time to thank Takeda for having sponsored this series of webinars. And thank you all for being here today with us. Please notice that by participating in this webinar, you agreed that we record the webinar and also post it in our YouTube channel for public access. So we want to spread the word on celiac disease, and that's why this webinar will be publicly available afterwards. And please not hesitate to use the chat. You can see an icon on the bottom of the screen where you can really type down your questions, concerns, and that will be addressed after the presentation of our speakers. So without further notice, really, I want to give the floor to Dr. Schuppan. I know that he is in transit from one place to another, but he had made the time to join us today. And so for that, double thank you to you. And I throw the question, what does it need to be done to make celiac disease more interesting for researchers? What are the obstacles? tell us about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Veronica. And thank you also to AOECS, which I think is a great initiative and very important for the patients, and the relevance of celiac disease really in the eyes of many people is increasing dramatically over the last few years. And I will start with a 5-slide presentation to highlight a few points and maybe to address a few points that have been alluded to by Veronica. Now I think I open the slide presentation. Let me see if that is the right screen now. Do you see the screen with the slide presentation?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, that's good. Then I can start. And no, I will skip that. So what is the current research landscape in celiac disease? And I think a lot has happened here. So celiac disease, which I abbreviate here, has become a role model also in immunology and internal medicine and research of a very well-defined disease, immunologically mediated disease. So it's not just celiac disease, also the mechanisms involved can play a significant role in understanding other diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, especially autoimmune disease, etc. So, of course, we have sorry, that should have been a genetic predisposition, which is predominant in celiac disease, the known DQ2, DQ8, which is a necessary but not sufficient predisposition. That means 30 to 40% of the population have it. But this is the major condition that people get celiac disease. There's essentially no celiac disease without that. And there's, of course, many other factors apart from the major trigger, which is gluten, or the only, let's say, specified trigger of celiac disease. But there's many other environmental factors that predispose the people that ingest gluten and have this genetic equipment, 30 to 40% of the population, to get celiac disease. These are nutritional factors, other minor genetic factors. These are is the microbiome that you have in your gut, for example. And then there is a high correlation, mainly due to genetics, but also due to active intestinal inflammation with other autoimmune diseases. 30% of the adult population with celiac disease have another autoimmune disease like type 1 diabetes, autoimmune thyroiditis, etc. Is there any problem? I don't think so. Okay. So what there is, of course, apart from immunological research, which is gaining interest, as I said, it's much better than 20 years ago now. There is also another research area like generating healthy grains, which for celiac disease, of course, is very difficult because a grain without gluten is not a classical grain. Then you can rather eat corn or millet or something like that. So obstacles to more research in celiac disease. Originally, it has been considered just a dietary problem like lactose intolerance or so, but now it's becoming recognized even among lay people who are not affected, that this is something that is a little bit more severe, because many people know people with celiac disease who have had complaints when they still consumed gluten, autoimmune diseases associated with that, etc. So the awareness has increased dramatically, also thanks to AOECS. And the obstacles for that reason have decreased. Also getting research money by statal funds. At least in Germany, it's pretty good for getting so-called DFG research projects with a good project on celiac disease. So we have two. One is with cardiology, and the cardiological effects of celiac disease in an experimental model of celiac disease, but also in patients. And the other one is the role of the so-called regulatory T cells in celiac disease, which are inhibitory cells of the inflammation that could also give a pathway to novel therapies. And that also means there is an increasing interest among researchers. There's definitely more female interest because females, for a good reason, and I support that very much because that's my opinion, are very interested in nutrition and health. So just to give you one busy slide, but just to show you approaches which are now also going into the pharmacological field. And as you know, there's several companies, big and small, involved in developing pharmacological therapies to support the gluten-free diet. So what we have here is the endothelial cell layer in the that is around the intestine, the gut. So it's some kind of gut barrier. These endothelial cells selectively take up nutrients, but also protect the rest of the gut and the body from invaders, bacteria, etc., by what they produce, mucin and defensive stuffs. But they are very important in regulating what comes in and what gets out. So, and these sit on connective tissue, and under this small connective tissue layer, you have the lamina propria, which is a very thin, you know that from your original sausage skins, a very thin layer of connective tissue, which contains the largest immune system of the body, the whole gut. It's the largest immune system, regulating many things. So the gut lamina propria, which is in this area, always is confronted with trace amounts of nutrients to maintain so-called tolerance. So it's necessary that some nutrient molecules get into the gut, that the gut has learned from early on to maintain tolerance to important nutrients that are relevant for, of course, for our health and living. And that can be disturbed by certain nutrients, but also bacteria, etc. So when you have gluten peptides now that get into the gut of everybody who eats gluten, more or less, in celiacs with some inflammation even more, these little balls are small parts of gluten molecules that are still intact. They have like up to 30, 40 amino acids in length, but they are a little bit fragmented, but not completely digested. And they can get, and that's the pathogenesis, in contact with the body's own enzyme, tissue transglutaminase. And this tissue transglutaminase reacts with gluten peptides to change their charge and their properties, especially with the gluten peptides. So there's a high affinity here. And then these changed gluten peptides, like every food stuff, gets antigenically presented on so-called antigen-presenting cells, like macrophages and monocytes via HLA DQ2, DQ8 here. And these are very good presenters for modified gluten peptides by the body's own enzyme transglutaminase. And this, with certain other cofactors, as I've mentioned, can, under certain circumstances, normally it induces tolerance to gluten and also modified gluten. But when other things come together, and we know many of them, but not all, then this can lead to an activation of gluten-specific T cells. And T cells are the so-called effector cells of inflammation. And these expand. It's like a foreign bug invades the gut, and the body senses this is something dangerous. So the T cells expand, they become more, they multiply, and these T cells can wreak havoc in the intestinal mucosa, which is just this compartment where the immune cells sit and upon which the epithelial cells sit, which are important in uptake of nutrients, etc. So this causes activation of these cells, especially when gluten is continuously fed. When patients are on a gluten-free diet, this stimulus is taken out again and the T cells get deactivated. They contract in a way. And this leads to healing, sometimes slow healing. and other cells are activated, and that causes what we see in histology when we take biopsies. That finally causes the complaints, malabsorption, because the gut mucosa is damaged, the epithelial cells don't work anymore, there's villous atrophy, all what you know about. And as a side reaction, in a way, is activation of the immune globulin producing B cells, antibody producing B cells, and these produce then antibodies against gliadins, but also the modified red circles, gliadins by the enzyme transglutaminase, and importantly also against the so-called autoantigen, the body's own enzyme, which normally never elicits antibodies because it's the body's own, but here is a conformation, what we call it, that causes an autoimmune antibody response, and these spill over into the blood, and that's what you can measure as elevated transglutaminase antibodies as a major marker of active celiac disease. Okay, so and now to date, we know that about 30% of adult celiacs still have complaints, not necessarily intestinal damage, severe damage, but mild damage and complaints despite a gluten-free diet. So to date, there is no approved medication, but I've listed here a few developments which are run by pharmacological companies and clinical researchers. And these are, you have heard about many of them, the glutenases that can further destroy and digest the gluten peptides, which are otherwise only incompletely digested. And with this digestion, even if they get into the lamina propria, they cannot bind to DQ2 or DQ8 anymore and activate T cells. So that's an approach with now very effective glutenases in clinical trials, especially one, semi-synthetic. Then we have biologicals. This is what you use in inflammatory bowel disease, anti-cytokine antibodies, for example.
Chodź tutaj do mnie, co ty robisz?
Okay, so we can silence that. And then there is tolerance induction. That means what you naturally have against foods. And also patients with DQ2, DQ8 normally have developed the tolerance to gluten. And only in certain circumstances, this changes to an aggressive immune response, that you regenerate tolerance. And this can be done by directing certain therapies to the spleen immune cells or the liver immune cells, currently within small nanoparticles, like with the vaccines. And these are loaded with gluten peptides, and this can cause a tolerance, the so-called regulatory T cells, which I've mentioned at the very beginning, that are just the opposite of inflammatory T cells, also some other mechanisms. And there's also studies of early phase going on, which show there is some efficacy. And then there is the inhibition of the enzyme, the body's own enzyme, transglutaminase, called TG2. And this is, in fact, the first large trial which we did that showed efficacy to prevent intestinal damage in a larger number of patients, dose-dependently, as an oral drug. So this is an interesting therapy. There is also now approaches also by the Australian groups of blocking the binding of the peptides, the gluten peptides, to HLA DQ2, DQ8 by an antibody that is infused or given sub-Q to patients that blocks the binding of the modified gluten peptides to the DQ2, DQ8. And that's interesting too, but it's in early development. And there is also an early development, quite interesting. It's a small molecule, as we say it, a pill again, that can really stabilize tight junctions. It's an agonist or an activator of so-called SIRT proteins that is also going into a clinical study. So, and just the last busy slide shows what Veronica has mentioned. Celiac disease itself is somewhat an autoimmune disease, but triggered by external gluten and kept alive by external gluten. So it subsides normally, but not always, when you cut out the gluten completely from the diet. And there's a big range of sensitivities among patients with celiac disease. And there's a host of autoimmune diseases that are genetically, but also in part by the activity of celiac disease, associated with active celiac disease, but also with inactive celiac disease. So autoimmune on the right side, you have as the most frequent associated autoimmune conditions, 30% in adults approximately. Some have even more than one with celiac disease. So celiac disease is a search disease for other autoimmune diseases if they are not apparent yet, also in small children. Autoimmune thyroiditis, there's Graves and Hashimoto's, type 1 diabetes. Also, patients with type 1 diabetes frequently have up to 5 to 10% also celiac disease. There is many of these autoimmune diseases, thyroid and type 1 diabetes in the so-called polyglandular autoimmune syndrome, type 3, even associations with CNS, central nervous system, multiple sclerosis, kidney disease, rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmune hepatitis, etc. There's a high association with biliary, what we call biliary, somewhat autoimmune liver diseases, and also an associated, not necessarily autoimmune, with a condition of the colon, of the large intestine, microscopic colitis. Of course, depending on the disease activity mainly, but not exclusively, infertility that can occur with active celiac disease, neuropathy, etc. And the secondary, let's say, consequences of active celiac disease is resorption deficiencies, long-term osteoporosis, anemia in small children, enamel defects. There is an autoimmune component too related to celiac disease. And even interestingly, and that's something we are focusing on, we have very good evidence mechanistically that active celiac disease worsens cardiovascular conditions. Okay, and I think I have the last slide here. So what about the mission of AOECS, which is very important. So definitely continuing to raise awareness in the public, also in view of the high frequency of celiac disease, which still often remains undetected, because the disease is the chameleon of internal medicine. As often said, it's not necessarily associated with intestinal problems, could be extra-intestinal, out of the gut problems, and even very unspecific things. So it's important to stress the relevance, as said, the high prevalence and the comorbidities. That means the other autoimmunities. And that's a strong point also regarding governmental institutions, etc. And of course, somehow nudging the funding bodies in the EU, but also in the US, NIH, or even joint projects and others. So of course, there is an increasing role in public-private partnerships, where also organization like AOECS is very important, also as a patient representative organization. And there is increasing interest, as mentioned, among biotech and big pharma now, because there's a high prevalence, there's a high unmet need, because even despite a gluten-free diet, to the best of the knowledge of the providers and the patients, often doesn't lead to complete remission and disappearance of symptoms, or even in intestinal inflammatory conditions. And several trials that we are now doing are just targeting this population of celiacs who have both complaints, which can be mixed, partly due to celiac disease, partly not due, and some inflammatory component and some villus atrophy. So celiac disease for the companies is becoming a very relevant, potentially big market, even bigger in numbers of patients than inflammatory bowel disease. I want to stop now. I needed a little longer, but it's a little intro. And I don't know how we do it now. Veronica, you manage how it goes on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Schuppan. I think we could listen to you for hours, but we need to give the floor to Dr. Rodriguez Herrera to give us his perspective from a clinical perspective. I'm glad to hear, Dr. Schuppan, that it feels that you have the impression that obstacles have decreased, and you have shown already some therapies that are going on that look promising for the celiac community. Dr. Rodriguez, do you feel related with the presentation from Dr. Schuppan, or do you have other views?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. I hope the quality of the sound will be okay. Well, I will like to share with the audience my experience in the last 25 years, where having worked as a clinician. To offer a little background by myself, I was trained in Spain, but I moved to Ireland looking for greener landscapes a few years ago. And through this time, I have seen, as Dr. Schuppan mentioned, how things have been changing. But there are many barriers and difficulties when you try to have some research activity in the field of a celiac disease and when you are a clinician. So I would like to share my screen now. So basically, in this area of celiac disease, when you're a clinician, you have to see how funding is currently going to other places. For example, in the United States, against 3 million annually given to the area of celiac disease, can be 60 million for Crohn's disease, 13 for Barrett's, or 7 million for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So that is a big barrier. There's not much money. So if I am a young doctor at the beginning of my career, or a dietitian or a nurse, want to pursue um, a research career, where can I find more easily money to develop my activities in other areas that are not celiac disease? So that way, many people will start in research activity in the area of celiac, they move to other fields. I have seen that happen to many of my colleagues that they left looking for an easier way to get and progress in the career. Remember that what move the research activity is not only curiosity. Many professionals need to progress in the research career to uh, grow and build a professional portfolio. So if you cannot easily publish a paper or have a presentation or get grants, that is going to be a barrier. So what they do, they move to other areas when they can be easier. Other barriers in the clinical field are the lack of protected time. My clinical activity is supposed to be 80% of my time, and the real world goes up to 95%. So at the end of the day, research is something that I'm probably doing after hours, where my family will be the main victim of my research activities, is not something that's protected in the hospital. And actually, in outside big academic center, research activity is not considered like a main activity. Only you're a big center where the goal of quality is to develop a portfolio of research, you will be having easier opportunities. In middle-sized, small-size hospital, is considered many times a secondary activity. Another important barrier is the lack of admin support. As Professor Schuppan knows, and anybody involved in research knows, there's a lot of time to be spent doing or completing applications. You have to be familiar with the regulation, you have to be familiar with the proceedings, and as a clinician, you may not have the time to be, become yourself familiar with all that process. Or this complex application process with the lack of admin support is also a big, big barrier to develop research. In a survey done between consultant and junior doctor in Wales in 2021, many of the doctor consultant highlighted they don't have time protected to develop that activity. This lack of protected time and lack of access to grants are a big barrier that at the end are making them to drop and quit research activity. So this lack of recognition for this activity in in the curriculum of junior doctors or consultants is a big barrier. Having several proposals to try to improve the situation. For example, increase government funding. And the way to get that is probably because the action of a celiac disease support association or charities or group of patients that can be lobbying to get this uh, higher interest from the government agency. Improve understanding of the role of celiac disease as a medical condition that's serious and long term is another really relevant point to get. Sometimes, and you see that in the transition from the patients from the pediatric age to adult, when that a child gets older and is transferred to the adult service, they have to compete with all these patients with cancer, all these patients with super complex condition, and many clinicians do not consider celiac a serious enough condition. They don't have a high level of mortality, there's no medication, and that is another barrier that makes research in the adult side very, very difficult. The lack of medication at the moment means there's no big pharma involved in the process of provide funding for research. That is actually in the process to change, and hopefully we will have other treatment in the next 5, 10, 15 years, because the pipeline of drugs research is now growing and growing. Finally, another barrier that I see is the lack of animal models for an easy research. There are many animal models in clinical research, from flies, C. elegans, zebrafish. I was lucky enough to use in the past, but we don't have a really easy model for research in celiac, what makes the whole immunology process of research much, much, much complex. So basically, this is the information that I I was expecting to share with you all. That's my vision as a clinician. Um, and these are what I think the main barriers that, to summarize, are the lack of protected time, the lack of proper funding, the need to get more support to consider celiac disease as a relevant condition that may have an impact in the future, mostly because the problem with bone health. That would be a big, big, big issue in the problem, and the lack of animal models that make more difficult to get research done easily. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really, this gives us a lot of food for thoughts. I want to now give the floor to the audience. Either you can raise your hand and speak directly. Use this opportunity. Really, not really often we have the opportunity to be in front of such a panel. So use the opportunity to raise your question, or you can type it in on the chat.
Yeah, but maybe I can just comment on also what my colleague said. I think definitely a lot has changed. Protected time is always a problem. So my usual work week is 70 to 80 hours without interruption. That's what I'm living with for decades. So, and I'm, of course, also a clinician, but I'm spending 25% of my time with patients, which is 20 hours per week. I think it's also different from country to country. I think, as said, now in Germany, it's not that bad to get some, let's say, local funding. On the European level, it's intermediate. I would say we have a European project too, with Norway and with Italy. That is a gluten challenge study. It's mainly clinical, but it's buttressed by basic research, certain malt extracts. And we use gluten challenge and mainly the IL-2 assay after 2 to 4 weeks as a surrogate of a gluten response in celiacs in remission, but also having a larger study in that. So, but this is based on defined malt extract. Do they really elicit signals of celiac disease, or can they be considered safe? That has got the interest of the EU. So this is currently funded by the EU. And as said, local projects that we have are research projects. We are pretty strong in celiac as well as in other research topics. We have a good animal model. It's not really published yet. It's a human transgenic DQ8 model, which has been first published by the group of Elena Verdu at McMaster University. And we are using it now really to test pharmacological agents and the effect of probiotics and the effect on cardiovascular morbidity. And it's very close to the human situation. You get all the changes, mild but significant upon gluten feeding. And you get drug effects like the transglutaminase inhibitor effect that we have now shown in the clinical study that appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine 1.5 years ago, 160 patients. where we now do a phase 2b study in 400, 450 patients with complaints still, no challenge, just complaints and histological minor damage. So we predicted that in the animal model that it's effective to prevent villus atrophy and intraepithelial lymphocytosis. So it's a pretty good animal model, which also is being used now by Joe Murray in the US, who had originally co-developed that. So all this foundation is improving. And as said, we could integrate in a so-called collaborative research center that is rotating around these regulatory T cells, 22 centers in different cities of Germany. We could integrate the celiac projects both with the animal model and with clinical studies. What is the role of these regulatory T cells in celiac disease and remission, etc.? So I think it's definitely improving. It's still not as easy as inflammatory bowel disease, which is a broad, let's say, expensive market, and IBD is still considered, although highly competitive on the pharma market, considered a very severe disease, and celiac disease not. But this is changing a little bit, and that's why I said also considering the autoimmune conditions associated with it, with active celiac disease or with the genes, is a strong point to say it's even more than a little gut inflammation and not well-being or something like that, or resorption defects. And once you have identified, you put the patients on a gluten-free diet, they are happy with it, socially happy, and it's ironically, and they get along very well with it. Everything is good then. It's like drinking too much alcohol. You stop the alcohol. It's very easy. You are too fat, obese. You just eat less and you get healthy, very easy problem. But there's big pharmacological enterprises even in obesity with GLP-1 drugs, etc., expensive drugs, like our good friend, the Tesla chief, who has lost 15 kilos in 8 weeks with Ozempic, I think. It's a GLP-1 drug, but people gain weight again if they stop it. But celiac disease is even more severe than obesity, which is an almost unsolvable problem for 80% of the obese population. So I think awareness is really increasing, and there we have, as researchers and clinicians interested in it, we have now also increasing possibilities to productively collaborate with the interested industry, not only to validate their novel medications, but also to get some additional support. And I think everybody is interested also in a tight collaboration with AOECS in a positive way, not influenced by commercial interests or so. So that's my little message, but it's different in different areas of the world, I would say.
Well, it's a very positive message, really. It gives us a lot of hope. Dr. Rodriguez, what would you react to?
Yeah, I agree in many of the points you mentioned. For example, I'm really confident in the role of the celiac societies and federation. Many years ago, in another life, when I was involved in the social movements, we saw how the pressure of social movement got in Spain changed the regulation to improve the access and the architectural barriers. It was a time ago when there was no easy access to many buildings or to public transport. So at that time, many people gather and they got to change the regulation and make the government more aware to spend more funding to improve the quality of life of the population. So, but that was not got just by the voice of the professionals. Had to be a voice of the members of society to be there. That recently happened also in the United States with some pressure movement from the equivalent to celiac society there got to increase the budget allocated to celiac research. Another role that celiac societies may have is make easier the connection between scientific groups or teams or clinicians. Be kind of a network. I was very lucky to see to be part of developing the gluten monogenetic peptides. The initial proof of concept was done without money. was that with the help of a group of enthusiastic patients that were involved from the very beginning, and a tiny budget got from some leftover from other projects. Only when we got something more solid, we were able to apply for more funding. So sometimes you have a good idea, you don't need a lot of money. Money will be needed later. But it's a lot about communication and interaction.
Okay, I'm happy to hear that we have a role to play, that we are gladly to contribute so that research in celiac disease increase and gets better. And as you both mentioned, the importance of raising awareness that is not just a little pain in the gut, but is something more complex and that deserves far more attention for all professionals. I know that Dr. Schuppan, you are going now to Florence probably to a conference.
No, that's not celiac disease. It's about liver fibrosis and biliary liver fibrosis. We do a lot in this field too. But what I wanted to add, a very important, let's say, collaboration or interaction of practicing physicians who are knowledgeable about celiac disease and the affected patients, because as Dr. Rodriguez Herrera very well knows, so we have a specialty clinic, which is the biggest, I think, in Germany for celiac patients with complications or with a lot of questions, or whole families where kids are affected or not yet and have autoimmunity, emerging type 1 diabetes risk, and all these things, and dietary problems. Although they have a strict gluten-free diet, they still have inflammation. There's differential diagnosis. And I think it's very important to expand this because celiac disease is so frequent. And now it's in many eyes of the general population because so many people now know, with more awareness and diagnosis, people who have celiac disease. It's not just because, let's say, I'm an expert there, but I hear that every time. And of course, now people talk to me, you are an expert there, and I know this and that, or even my family of people who had never said that before, whom I know for a long time. So I think this practical interaction supported by the international society, and which is handed over to the local societies, and to have some, let's say, interactive events with the patients is so valuable. It is so much fun, I must say, to be able to help with some clarifications or raising some points with the patients affected, but also to spread the message as, let's say, an expert, as a physician or maybe dietitian too. I think there we would also be happy to continuously have the support and to spread the message and the information about celiac disease. And for that, and this is intimately linked also to more public funding, awareness, etc. And so many practitioners are now confronted with questions about celiac disease, much more than 20 years ago. So they want to know a little bit more, not to be the dummies among the physicians. So I think it's on a good way, but it needs further support also by the AOECS.
Wonderful final words. I don't know, Dr. Rodriguez, if you would like to say something else.
That's just really support and agree with what have been mentioned.
Wonderful.
I just say thank you again for your invitation.
Oh, well, thank you. It is a great pleasure, a fantastic opportunity to learn more about what is the status of the art in research. I think at least I'm living with a good and optimistic feeling that we can do better and that we are going in the right direction. So thank you for giving us that reassurance that I think we needed. And absolutely, we will be there to support more practical collaboration and interaction. I think we need to support each other, and we will be there to do that. Thank you so much again for your time. And well, see you again soon, I hope.
Yes, and thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.